Hello and welcome to Module 4. This covers material in Chapter 4 in your textbook by Koningberger and Briggs. So I called this discussion this week, this conference discussion in this module, the High Middle Ages continued, because we're going to continue a lot with the themes that we started talking about last module. With the growing wealth of many of these societies. Again, if you look at your chapter and make sure you have your textbook and you're looking through the specific chapter sections on these topics that I highlight in this brief presentation, because it's in the textbook that these themes will be fleshed out. And I understand a few of you still don't have your textbook, so make sure that you pick those up as soon as possible, because you can't pass those quizzes without the textbook. Okay, so the Little Ice Age, as it was called, was kind of receding in many ways. It was becoming warmer. The population was growing in the 12th and 13th centuries, especially in certain river valleys. Rivers are still important to human civilization as the main ways of inland transportation. So the most prosperous areas tended to be along these rivers, like the Rhine River in what is today Germany, the Thames River in England, which is where London is located, the Po River, for example, in Italy. These were the places where you would have found growing population, growing wealth. There also continue to be these waves of migration. In your textbook, it talks about the Anglo-Normans. Remember, the Normans are the French Normans, and the Anglos are the early English people in England, around London and places like that. And they, you read about Edward I of England, who advances England's borders across that region known as Wales and the mountains there. But then there are also migrations. You remember last time last module we read about the Vikings and their kind of plundering lifestyle and their fast-moving ships and the element of surprise that they brought with them when they moved in quickly on, unsuspecting towns and villages, and especially monasteries. We talked about that last semester. But there's still movements of people, especially what's fueling the movement of people. Think of migrations, or what we also call diasporas, which are dispersals of peoples, as having push and pull effects. By that I mean there are some forces that are pushing people out of one region, and there's other forces that are pulling them to go other places. So one of the main things is that as you had this population growth and the peasant population growing, you also had further division of property between people. So people were trying to make a living on smaller and smaller pieces of land in a situation where that meant their families would slowly be more and more impoverished. It would have been the groups of what we call free peasants, those peasants that weren't directly on a feudal estate. And these peoples as well would be pushed out of those regions because they don't have much land and much way to create wealth. And they're pulled to regions, of course, where there's going to be land opportunities. And so in this case, we're talking about Germanic peoples. Remember, there's not one Germany at this time, lots of Germanic-speaking peoples, along the Rhine River, in that kind of middle of Western Europe. Most of that area would be German-speaking. And those people are migrating in waves of migration eastward into places specifically like Poland. Your textbook gives the really good estimation that Poland's population was only a couple of people per square mile. That's an empty kind of land. It was mostly forested in that, so it would have been some tough going in that, bears and wolves and things like that. But if you could clear yourself a patch of land in this desolate environment, you could probably make a go of it. So there were these movements of people then at this time, and this module, we're really covering the time just before the Black Death, the plague, which comes to Europe via the Silk Road. It's thought really that land route from Asia to Turkey and then to Europe and North Africa, that the plague came over that Silk Road, probably along the trade routes, by way of fleas that were on the rats, and the fleas bit the people, and that's how the plague was spread. But I want to save that conversation mostly for next module. But you should be aware that that's coming up, because in some ways you have these social problems like overpopulation and not enough access to land. Well, vicious though it may sound, and I don't mean to be unfeeling or anything, but once the Black Plague ends as well, there'll be new opportunities for people, more access to land and things like that. So, but we'll save that for this week, for next week or next module. In this module, we're still talking about relatively happy days, right? Population growth, better weather, better harvests, a growth in coinage, like we talked about last module. That means coins, silver coins, gold coins. The gold florin in Italy was probably the most famous of these coins at this time. But that meant that there was this increasing money economy. People weren't just bartering anymore. One good for another, kind of trading and swapping goods. But they were using money and exchange mechanisms. And you also then have the rise of what we might even call today white-collar jobs. Things like money lenders, money exchangers, because every city-state, for example, in Italy would have its own coinage. Its own money. So how does that convert one gold florin to an English silver penny, for example, for traders bringing these different coins? Well, they had a way of a calculation for exchanging money, and just like today, that exchange system began to develop, and it would change depending on the economies of these places. Okay, this is also the time of dazzling courts surrounding kings, the continued growth of kings at this time. And we begin to see a real setup as well of the conflicts between kings and the papacy, kings and the church, secular power versus religious power. This is a time you can read in chapter 4, pay attention to Rudolph of Habsburg. And that name Habsburg may sound familiar to some of you, because that's going to be the rise. The Rudolph of Habsburg is going to be one of the first real important kings of this new Habsburg Empire or Habsburg dynasty, this royal family that will dominate Austria, some of the Germanic states in Austria, right up until the 19th century. So like 600 years from this point forward. But kings at this time are increasingly feeling more prosperous. Philip IV of France was one such king, and they want to extend their royal authority. And the church, being the most prosperous institution in medieval times, one of the things they wanted to extend their power over was the church and the church's wealth, and they wanted to be able to tax the church's wealth in some ways. They get their hands on all of those extraordinary riches. And so Philip IV of France then finds himself in a really intense battle with the papacy, as it's called, or with the Pope, and the church is also fighting back in its way. The Pope issues one of his what's called a papal bull. This is a decree. One of the highest of the Pope's sort of orders, to fight back against Philip IV. This is kind of the time when outright war at times will break out between the church and some of these kings who still need the church as well. But to make in some ways a long, pretty complex story short, the kings begin to get the upper hand in some important ways, and in some ways that the Holy Roman Emperor begins to be weakened at this time. That's that confederation of feudal estates and lords that are held under that thing that's called the Holy Roman Empire. Remember, I've described it before as the Holy Roman Empire isn't terribly holy. I mean, just not terribly associated with the church. It's really not much of an empire. But what is gaining strength are some of these kings, like Philip IV of France, Rudolph of Habsburg, for example. You can read it in your textbook about the Civil War, which occurs in Italy at this time, and in Sicily, which is the island off the coast of southern Italy. There's also, moving on to sort of cultural and religious history at this time, there's also changes in piety. Piety is the word that we use for one's faith and how you express your faith. And there's kind of an explosion of these different ideas at this time, the establishment of the Franciscan monks at this time. And you can read there about the Cathars as well, who believe in the idea of dualism and purity on earth as much as possible. Dualism means that struggle between good and evil. And a lot of these theologies really did not follow at all Catholic teachings. So Catharism is going to be identified by the Pope and by the Catholic Church as a heresy, and is going to be largely crushed. But it's still going to have a large effect, especially in southern France and in that region, in the mountains of southern France. You can also read about the Templars. This was a religious orders of knights established during the time of the Crusades to protect the Crusaders. Again, Philip IV of France saw them as a threat to his power, so he attempts to crush them, and that order is condemned. The other theme at this time is rising intolerance as well for non-Christians. So they're becoming increasingly concerned with some of these groups within Christianity, like the Cathars and Catharism, but also against Jews and Muslims as well, and those communities. There's a Jewish diaspora, Jewish immigration at this time. largely to Eastern Europe because there's growing intolerance in Western Europe for Jews. This is a time of the medieval pogroms. A pogrom is what we would almost call today ethnic cleansing. And you can read about how Edward the First exiled thousands of Jews from England in 1390. Arranged transportation by sea for them out of England, and similar movements as well occurred in other places against Jews in Europe. And we have some of the last of the Crusades that occur at this time. The fifth and the sixth Crusade. This is a time when the Crusaders stormed the city of Byzantium and plunder it. So there's, one of the things that is going to make Byzantium, otherwise known as Constantinople, so susceptible as well, within 100 or 200 years and weakened, is because Christians themselves from Western Christianity, from the Catholic Church, attacked the Eastern Church at Byzantium on their way to the Jerusalem. And this begins to weaken Byzantium or Constantinople. And there's not as much cooperation between the East and the West, between Rome and Byzantium. So you can also read about the tragic crusade that children were sent on by sea, and many of them end up drowning. It's quite a fascinating story. And also you can read and should be aware about of the Mongol invasions. Now I have a map here that I'll show to you in the goals and objectives page in this week's module. So make sure you check that out. The Mongols were the last of the invading horsemen and women, nomadic peoples from the east. They come from as far away as the steppes of Asia, these kind of prairie lands, and they were excellent horsemen and archery, another area of warfare that they excelled at. And they really roll over the top of many of these, what it should have been, one would have thought, stronger civilizations, because they conquer lands as far east as Korea, and moving as far west as Poland into the Germanic regions of Western Europe, where they come to a halt. But this is the last of these invasions by nomadic people on horseback from the east. If you remember, we've talked about them these sorts of groups periodically. The Huns, for example, and see how these names that get attached to them also have become in our language, in our society, kind of words of insults, such as Huns are thought of as barbarians and uncultured. Of course, these were the groups that had attacked the Roman Empire. And now we have the Mongols as well, that are described as the golden horde of people from the east. This, of course, is a Western bias. Yes, they were largely illiterate, or they didn't have the written language, at least not that much, and they were nomadic peoples. But it's our kind of Western bias to see them as inferior. So keep that in mind as well. They don't leave the Mongols don't leave much of a cultural legacy in a lot of these places, especially where they went in Europe, because they didn't end up settling there in large numbers. They also did not leave any religious legacy at this time with them. They would eventually convert to both Buddhism and then also in regions they settled, they would convert to Islam as well. But they didn't leave a really large cultural footprint behind because they were nomadic and because a whole lot of settlers didn't follow them to settle the land and leave this cultural footprint of their culture, their whatever it may be, their religion, their music, their songs, their ways of life, right? Even their cuisine, right? They don't have a lot of legacy, but we still should remember them as being this incredible fighting force that rolled over parts of Eastern to Central Europe at this time. Okay, and then there is reforms, or what we might see as the beginning of reforms at this time, especially religious people like Thomas Aquinas, Aquinas, Thomas Aquinas. Make sure you're familiar with him and his emphasis on the rational, natural world. At points he sounds almost a little bit like the philosophers of the Enlightenment. He believed the natural world was important to understand and to study, and he sought to bring into a kind of compatibility ancient philosophy and ideas of rational thought and reason with Christianity. That Christianity was a reasonable, rational religion. Okay. We also have the beginning of vernacular languages becoming important for literature and histories that are written. When I say a vernacular language, most written language in this part of the world would have been mostly all in Greek Latin prior to this point, not Greek. Most of it would have been in Latin. If you would have been in Byzantium and Constantinople eastward, then it would have been mostly in Greek. In Western Europe, it would have been mostly in Latin. That's the ancient language of the Roman Empire, of course. So the fact that they were beginning to translate or write in more local languages, such as French, such as Middle English or Old English. Remember, these languages, as they were spoken 500, 600, 700 years ago, are different from the languages that we speak today, that people speak today, because languages change over centuries. But you have the recording of histories. The history of St. Louis, for example, is important. You have important sagas and epics being written down, reflecting different values of the time of chivalry, for example. My favorite here is one of the Germanic sagas that's told is Siegfried the Dragon Slayer, for example. So you can learn a lot about chivalry and the culture of chivalry at this time through the troubadours of southern France. These are the kind of romantic poets, sometimes songsters as well, who sang their poems, but they were renowned for this idea of romantic love, and kind of stories of lost paradises. Quite interesting literature beginning to emerge at this time. It has an enormous impact on later culture, especially ideas of courtly love. Okay, then I would be remiss if I didn't also mention the rise of the Gothic cathedrals at this time and Gothic architecture. The flying buttress was the architectural design that was so awe-inspiring. And cathedrals were meant to sort of overwhelm you. They were huge. They were up to 300, 250, 300 feet tall, for example. That's practically a football field tall that you could look across a flat plain and see it for miles away. These things had symbolic meaning. They were meant to be, of course, the most grandiose thing that man could create in homage to God and worship to God. And yet they had symbolic meanings as well of the harmony of the universe and God as the ultimate creator. And this exotic style of architecture spreads everywhere across Europe at this time, except for to Italy, where the Pope and where the Church was so strong with its own architectural traditions there. But you can look in the picture in your textbook there of the Salisbury Cathedral for example. And then finally, I want you to look closely at that conclusion of chapter 4, and that's what we're going to talk about in your textbook, which is supposed to be a more general conversation that I want to have on what was it that made some of these kingdoms so dynamic, so flexible and able to grow for the future. One of the theories that's been put forward at this time is although Europe became less international this time and in some ways more intolerant towards especially non-Christians within their midst, they also became very competitive with one another. The kingdoms, these rising secular kingdoms, began competing with one another for supremacy in their particular region. And they began to innovate in order to keep up with the neighboring kingdoms. So they began investing in kind of reasoned, rational reforms that would make their military stronger, that would make technological changes that would give them power. They began experimenting with better ways of managing their lands to make them more fertile. In the Netherlands, they began rolling back the sea, literally almost, by building dikes and reclaiming swampy lands for fertile lands close to the sea. But these were techniques that were adopted in many ways in a competitive environment. So that's what I want to talk about in the discussion this week. That's quite a bit of material. Pay attention to all of those terms that I've mentioned. Those are the types of things that may appear on your quiz, as well as on your midterm exam, which is going to be coming up as well. So more about that soon, and thanks for watching and listening. I'll see you on the discussion boards.